ready to travel through time. Today, we're diving deep into the world of poetry. It's history, to be more specific.
And it's a long one, right?
It really is.
Tied to like all of human history.
Yeah, we won't be focusing on just one poet or even one time period today. We're taking the broad view,
I liked it.
like a greatest hits of poetry through time.
Because if you look at how poetry changes,
Yeah.
you can actually learn a lot about people.
I love that. And one of the sources we used,
Good.
it painted this really vivid picture.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine thousands of years ago, people are huddled around a fire.
The OG campfire stories, right?
Right, but they weren't just for fun.
No.
This was how history was passed down mythology.
Oh, wow.
Practical knowledge.
I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, like imagine history you didn't read but experienced through these powerful words with rhythm.
So important back then, right? When basically everything was oral tradition.
Yeah.
Like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh yeah, from Mesopotamia.
Yeah. One of the oldest stories we have.
And it's a poem.
A poem that's super important to their entire culture.
Interesting.
Like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
By Homer.
Shaped so much of Greece.
It's amazing when you think about it. Like,
Yeah.
those words weren't just words back then.
Right.
There were, like, these cultural foundations.
Absolutely. And, as we go from those early epics
Okay.
into, like, the classical period,
Mhm.
we see this really interesting shift.
What's that?
Poetry starts to get way more personal.
So less about gods and monsters.
Well, they're still around, of course.
Right.
But now it's like we're exploring what it means to be human
I like it.
in a whole new way.
So who are we talking about here?
Well, there's one really big name
Okay.
from this period, Sappho.
Sappho.
Yeah, an ancient Greek poet who wrote about love and loss.
Still writing about that today.
I know, right? And get this.
Okay.
Her poems, they were meant to be read with music.
Really?
Yeah, like a lyre.
Wow. So different from how we experience poetry now.
Right. Talk about setting the mood.
Totally. But it's interesting.
What's that?
You have Sappho exploring these deeply personal themes.
Okay.
But at the same time, across the Mediterranean, there's Virgil
Oh, yeah.
in Rome who's writing about Roman history and myth.
Totally different vibe.
Yeah.
But it shows how different cultures were using poetry in their own way.
And it's not just Greece and Rome either.
No?
During the same time
Yeah.
in China,
Mm-hmm.
you have poets like Li Bai and Du Fu.
Their work is incredible.
What makes it so special?
Well, Li Bai's poetry is all about nature,
Okay.
friendship, the simple joys,
Yeah.
But then you have Du Fu.
Okay.
He wrote about war poverty,
Oh.
the struggles of everyday people.
So they're showing us like a wider range of human experience.
Yeah, and it's proof that some things
Like what?
are universal no matter the time period.
That's a good point.
We're talking about how poetry captures feelings, but it also captures the spirit of the time.
Totally. And speaking of capturing a spirit, Li Bai and Du Fu are writing in China.
Yeah.
But at the same time, on the other side of the world, you have Rumi.
Oh, I love Rumi.
He was writing during the Islamic Golden Age.
Okay.
And his poems, they still resonate today.
They do.
It's all about the soul, right? Our connection to something bigger.
Like that.
Those big questions humans always ask.
Yeah, and so far
Yeah.
we've talked about storytelling and myth-making and personal feelings.
Right.
But things start to change in the Middle Ages, right?
They do.
Like poetry takes on these new forms.
It's like poetry got a whole upgrade. It's like poetry got a whole upgrade. Yeah, like a toolbox.
Like new tools, like those sonnets we still read today.
Exactly. Those sonnets, 14 lines, specific rhymes,
Right.
even that rhythm thing.
Iambic pentameter.
Yeah, that. And it wasn't just to sound fancy.
I mean, it does sound kind of fancy.
But it does, but those structures, it gave poets all these ways to play with language.
To like pack more meaning in.
Exactly.
It's like poetry went from these rivers of words.
To something more structured, like a cathedral built out of language.
I like that a lot. And, inside those new structures, poets were telling some really incredible stories.
It's like Chaucer.
Yes. Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales.
Weren't those a bunch of stories in one big story?
It's like a snapshot of medieval England.
Wow.
All these different people, knights, nuns,
Okay.
all going on this pilgrimage together.
Sound like a road trip.
And they're telling stories along the way, each one little window into that world.
And Chaucer tied it all together with poetry.
He was a master.
Speaking of masters, what about Dante's Divine Comedy?
Talk about ambitious. Through hell, purgatory, and heaven.
And he put it all into verse.
It's hard to imagine the amount of work that took.
It really is. And of course, you can't talk about poetry without Shakespeare.
The OG.
Right. Such a master of language plays and those sonnets.
They're still everywhere for a reason.
Why is that?
The way he wrote about love, time, death.
Big topics.
Huge. And he fits so much meaning into just 14 lines.
It's like bottling lightning.
And he's not alone either. This is where poetry starts to change.
Wow.
It's not just stories anymore.
Yeah.
It's how they express themselves.
Sharing their views of the world.
Exactly. Poets were challenging things, making their voices heard.
And then came the Romantics.
Right. Total game changers.
Yeah, it's like they said, forget the rules, let's feel things.
Feelings, nature, the whole shebang.
Like that famous line, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings.
Wordsworth nailed it right there.
So less about structure, more about letting those emotions flow.
Yeah. It was about breaking free, celebrating what makes you you.
So was that like the bridge then?
What do you mean?
From the older poetry to what we think of as modern?
It was a bridge. Yeah, you could say that for sure.
So what came after that?
Well, the Romantics sort of opened up this whole new world, right?
Okay.
And poetry kept on changing into the 20th century.
This is where things get kind of crazy, right?
It gets interesting.
Well, it's like modernism.
Exactly. Modernism was all about breaking the rules.
No more sonnets.
Well, they were still around, but poets like T.S. Eliot
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
and Ezra Pound, they wanted to experiment.
What kind of experiments are we talking about?
It wasn't just about the way poems looked on the page.
What else then?
It was the words themselves, the topics they were tackling.
Like what kinds of topics?
Well, instead of just writing about nature,
okay.
they were writing about cities, about the feeling of being lost after the world wars.
So heavier stuff.
Definitely more about the messiness of life.
So poetry went from celebrating feelings to like dissecting them.
In a way, yeah, and this led to some really powerful stuff.
Like who?
Sylvia Plath and Sexton, they were part of this group called the Confessional Poets.
What made them so different?
They wrote about things that were deeply personal, sometimes really painful.
So it's like they were taking those raw emotions and putting them right on the page.
Exactly. No more hiding behind metaphors or fancy language.
Just straight up honesty.
And that's what I think is so cool about poetry.
What's that?
It never sits still, you know? Always changing, reflecting what's happening in the world.
And now here we are in the 21st century.
And poetry is everywhere you look, right?
Yeah, it really is. Like spoken word poetry.
It's like we've circled back around to that oral tradition.
From those campfires we talked about.
Exactly. But with a modern twist.
Poetry slams open mics.
So much energy, so immediate.
And then there's social media.
Oh yeah, Instagram poets, Twitter threads turned into haikus.
It's crazy how adaptable poetry is.
It finds a way.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. What, thousands of years of poetry?
Something like that.
So what have we learned? What surprised you?
You know, for me, the biggest takeaway is that poetry, it's not just this old dusty thing.
Right. It's not just in textbooks.
It's alive. It's always changing right alongside us.
Trying to make sense of the world.
And our place in it.
It makes you wonder what poetry will look like in the future, doesn't it?
It really does. What will they write about us?
Now, those are questions worth thinking about.
They really are.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder.
To your own poetic musings.
Exactly. Thanks for diving deep with us today.